So I made a video about immortality on the Juggalo a Day collab channel that I post videos on every Saturday. Before I get into this, I want to apologize to my friend Jerz for being acrimoniously critical of the topic he chose for last week. I hadn't watched his video on the topic until after I posted my own, and I didn't realize just how much immortality meant to him, so I'm sorry for not being as whimsical as you expected me to be, Jerz. I got nothing but love and respect for you, and you know I'd never do anything to deliberately offend you. Now, when I made the video, I was essentially refuting the idea of being ultimately immortal in a sense that you could avoid every conceivable way of death, and not just one isolated way. I watched Clonzepam's response to Jerz, and he had a link to a page that described something called biological immortality, which has been discovered in certain species of bacteria, jellyfish, etc., and these species were supposedly immune to age, and could not die from age alone. Biological immortality is when you can die by external factors like decapitation, but you just don't get any older. I accept that as a possibility, and I never meant to assert that agelessness was impossible in and of itself, but my primary intention was to conclude that if you were ever born, you are incapable of avoiding all forms of death, so that nothing could kill you. So I posted that video on my Facebook page, and I got a comment on it that expressed sort of a different look on immortality. The guy said this: "The concept of immortality for a human mostly means the continued existence of a person's mind, its perception, and self-awareness. Immortality does not mean invulnerable. Immortals could still technically be killed. As for the possible immortality achievable by humans, if it were possible to completely upload a personality to a computer or replicate it into another form leaving all memory intact, that would be a limited immortality of a sort, but immortality akin to that of a god, invulnerable, immortal, etc., is theoretically impossible for a human to achieve. As you said, you cut our heads off and we'll die." I responded with this, and this was before I saw the page describing biological immortality. Even if you can take someone's memories and personality and put them in another form, the original form will still be subject to death. And if you put them into a computer, the computer may be ageless and able to remain active over hundreds or thousands of years, but a computer is still destructible. The memories themselves aren't inherently immortal either because they need some form of technology to prolong their existence. It's not immortality if you can die or be destroyed. End comment. And of course, I meant immortality in a sense that nothing could kill you whatsoever, as opposed to sheer agelessness. Then he said this: "Reread my response. I was describing the pinnacle of potential human longevity, limited immortality, the extension of self over a long period of time, rather than biological alone. If you become able to replicate the self, then you biological continuance have cheated finite life. If you can continuously and without limit create a sustaining procedure with which to extend your own life through technology or otherwise, then you have become in essence immortal. Maybe not by literal interpretation, but in the spirit of the concept of immortality, if you find a way to avoid the loss of self, are you not immune to the finality of death?" Then another guy left a comment and said this: "I would say that brain uploading is not practical. I believe it is flawed in the aspect that it's merely duplicating an entity and not preserving it. My approach to preserving oneself would be a network of similar brains that communicate and alter one another based on any biological alteration they would undergo. In sense, it would be preserving the continuation of a singular experience. If a brain, for example, was destroyed, a new one could be cultured and wired to assimilate with the others. What's interesting is what the sense itself would experience if two of these brains were significant distances from one another, being that the two brains would perceive the same event at different times." Now here's what I have to add. Okay, so I see what you're getting at. You're saying if you can somehow preserve the existence of the mind, this constitutes immortality. I respectfully disagree. You said immortals could still technically be killed. Perhaps that's true in the biological sense, but I do interpret that as an oxymoron. What if I said something like mortals could still technically live for eternity? If you take someone's mind and upload it to a computer, you're only prolonging its existence. Sure, you may have cheated finite life and given someone a few extra years to live, but the computer that you use as the vessel for a person's mind is still destructible. Even if you put someone's mind into a computer, unless you make the computer a living entity, that computer is neither mortal nor immortal. The mind would essentially only be data. And you wouldn't call Photoshop software on a computer mortal or immortal, would you? No, because a computer is not a conscious living entity. So being able to preserve the mind as data on a computer is not immortality. If you put someone's mind into a computer, and you are turning that computer into a conscious and perceptive entity, at that point, you're judging whether the computer is mortal or immortal and not the mind, because a mind is not a living entity in and of itself. It is the consciousness of a living entity. Mortality and immortality judge the entity that has the mind. If you looked at me right now, would you say that only my mind is mortal? No, you'd say that I, as a human being, am mortal. If you said, I am mortal, but my mind is immortal, then my mind would be able to remain intact after I die, even after trillions of years, and you'd be able to pull it out of my dead corpse and put it into another human being or computer. I'm going to die, and my mind is going to vanish into oblivion. If you put someone's mind into another human body, and you keep doing that for thousands of years, every human body you use will be doomed to death. You haven't achieved immortality just because you can preserve the existence of a mind. Even after 1,000 years, if that person falls into a lava pit, boom, dead, no immortality. You may be able to avoid death that is brought with age, but you are not immune to death, period. That's my whole point. Cut a person's head off who has a mind that has existed for 1,000,000 years, and immortality takes its toll. Just because you can survive age doesn't mean you can't die. The elves in Lord of the Rings perhaps could survive age, but they could still die in war. Just because you can outlive somebody doesn't mean you're immortal. Besides, how did those elves even age? Surely they weren't always adults, were they? They didn't spring out of their moms' vaginas as adults. They were infants, and they became adults. So how could they age at one point but no more? How come no elves stop aging as infants or toddlers or teenagers or elders? And you have elves like Elrond who appear to be in their 40s and elves like Haldir in their apparent 20s. So what determines when you stop aging if you can supposedly be an immortal that can be killed? If it's ever achievable that we can somehow take a mind and put it into another person and another person over the course of trillions of years, that's just avoiding the death of age. Perhaps humans could somehow extract the traits of agelessness from other species and implement them into humans, but in my video, I was stressing immortality in any and all conceivable aspects and not just agelessness. And perhaps agelessness is possible, but even if it is, the conclusion of my prior immortality video was how life would lose value without death. But of course, that's just my own opinion. Biological immortality or agelessness may be feasible, but as for ultimate inviolable immortality, where you have a 0% death rate, that's implausible. That's infeasible. As for being able to transfer a person's mind from entity to entity in order to prevent the mind from being obliterated, I don't know. I wouldn't consider that immortality. Of course, this is just from my own subjective perspective, so what the fuck do I know? I'm just a fucking smartass. If you wish to see my prior video on immortality, I'll put a link to it in the description. I hate it when my hair fucking does this. My bangs aren't long enough to put in my fucking hair tie. Ugh. I am a royal prick. Stick to your guns, light your own path, and biohazard for fucking life.